this happened through, first of all, pain, the pain of war, let's say, because we discovered that if you're not together, you're apart. And if you are apart, it can be a very painful experience. Whether it's possible or not, time will show. But whether we should work towards that direction, I would say yes, definitely. That's the answer. We can't do that. We cannot just wait and hope. Yes, it's a huge challenge. Perhaps the biggest is actually politics, or if you like, governance. Right. These debates started in China, and I was shocked of how open these debates were. If you develop products that they cost the billions, and then the market doesn't take it, basically, and then you have to even to ban them, that's can be really costly.
It's great to have you here today.
Very glad to be here with you.
I see that you've coordinated international projects involving access to pharmaceuticals. So obviously this is a very timely subject. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts regarding the current race to distribute vaccines?
Yeah, well, although as you have seen, my background is mainly in public perceptions of science and technology. So the access to the pharmaceuticals, the access to medicine, it was a kind of a side issue, but very close to my heart as well. That's why I got involved in that. And obviously, what we see happening now, or actually we haven't seen it happening yet, because we still don't have the vaccine even here in Europe, as much as we'd like to, but it will become more and more of a serious issue, I think, later on this year, and particularly the next couple of years, that will see this inequality in access to yet another vital medicine, another vital pharmaceutical, the corona vaccine. There are many reasons for that, but the whole point, I suppose, in access to pharmaceuticals is that we do have a very unequal, let's say, legislation, and when it comes to intellectual property rights, which definitely benefits not only, of course, the big pharma, but also the more advanced economies. And we need to work actually more into the intellectual property rights legislation globally in order to amend, let's say, these inequalities. But it's not an easy issue at all, by the way, as you can imagine.
I think we started with on a bang.
Yes.
And if we have time, we can chat a bit more.
Yeah.
I thought, look, I really enjoyed reading your research, and I know that I've probably only read 1% of the body of work that you've done. And what I found interesting is that you have done a lot of comparative work. So culture versus culture, national versus international, governments versus the people, in terms of the different values, interests, perceptions that each have when it comes to science and technology policies and practices. So then, what is good science and technology policy or process? Are there any particular characteristics that one should look for?
Yes. Okay. The next $1 million question. To start with, yes, I've since the beginning, since also my PhD years, a long time ago, actually, I had this opportunity, which wasn't that obvious at the time, because it was the beginning of these international comparisons on science and technology perceptions, public perceptions. And that was also the first time that we really had the chance to look at how different publics, how different cultures see and assess science and technology policy, science and technology developments. Particular developments at the time was in biotechnology. And immediately we saw that there were very significant difference, actually, even within Europe. Between the different European publics at the time. We're talking about the early 90s. And we had even the most obvious, also political difference, let's say, reflected in this perception. So it was East versus West, for instance, or North versus South. things that we still see, of course, nowadays, but not as strongly, as significant differences as we once actually saw. And that started us actually going into really trying to figure out what kind of values are behind these public perceptions, the difference. That brought us to basically the political system that is also related to the values system that we see in the society, and how the political system reacts to this value system. And therefore, we end up with very different policies when it comes to the science and technology and innovation, by the way, development. So if one must make a very, let's say, a crude summary of what makes a good policy. A good policy is both a policy that's socially sustainable. It is a policy that not only is aware of societal conflict, societal issues, let's say, societal concerns about a specific technology, and deals with these concerns, but also one that is trying to minimize the conflict via open debate, via an open science, as we call it nowadays, perspective, but also one that has a specific leadership, shows leadership actually in this based on these values, because the values are there not only as vague, let's say, norms in society. They are there written, actually, written in our constitutions, written in our treaties, written in our strategies. So there are very specific values that we have to follow. And it is good if we stick with these values, because they are the result of very long discussions in society.
Were the discussions involving a diverse range of people, so the public as well as people who work in policy? How did those values get developed in the first place?
There is the should and how they should develop, and sometimes how they develop. What value is, it's already a contentious discussion. We don't have a common understanding of what creates, let's say, the value. What are the historical, let's say, a movement that has created a specific value in society. We have tried to do that, but there is also a limit to how one can go into this kind of discussion. I'd say that the value is a common agreement of what is right and what is wrong in society. And this common agreement is changing with time. So what is a good value today is not necessarily a good value tomorrow. The same thing that we have seen with in our work in public perceptions of science and technology. They change through time. That's a good thing, you know, they should change. Because the debate change, the science change, the development change, the applications of the development change a lot. So we should always be aware that the creation of a value is through a continuous feedback between science, policy, and society. And every now and then we need to, of course, to establish, to write them, if you like, in a kind of stone type of idea. So we create a treaty. Like we have in our case, we have the treaties in the European Union that created the European Union, and they specifically refer to the values of the European Union. And the same, of course, with the constitutions around the world. But one has to be, of course, open to this change. And the only way to be open to the change is to have a continuous debate, a continuous dialogue with society. And that's what we try to do as well. That is basically a big part of our job. And try to be a part, to oversee these dialogues that happen in society, and to, if you like, not exactly predict, because it's a strong word, but try to foresee what kind of issues and concerns we might have with specific developments, specific scientific developments.
It's really interesting because obviously Europe is a very diverse, I mean, it's very diverse, different values, different cultures. And then we have the European Union, which you just said has a, values set. written down. So uh, how was the prioritization, and how did those values, how did that align with national values? Because I imagine that'd be quite important when it comes to things like developing policies.
Well, not an easy task, but by the way, whenever I talk to my colleagues from I don't know, like big countries like China, for instance, or even the US, and people will tell you that's okay, that's a European thing or whatever. You try to explain to them that Europe is not really a kind of single idea, it's not a single country. There are so many countries, so many ideas, they're really different here and there. And then they tell you, yeah, well, it's exactly the same in our country. And China is a single country as far as you're concerned but if you see it from inside, there are huge differences between, I don't know, urban and rural areas, between the east and the west, between the Cantonese and the let's say the Mandarin language groups, and so on and so forth. And these are significant difference for them, but not for us. We see kind of a single system. Now, of course, saying that Europe is still an amalgamation of 27 countries, let's say the European Union at least. And that means almost as many languages. And in terms of political systems, at least two big, let's say the East and the West type of system that came together in Europe, plus the traditional and historical differences between the different countries, between North and South, and so on and so forth. So for me, it has been a great achievement that we have created and kept more or less that European Union together. And this happened through, first of all, pain, the pain of war, let's say, because we discovered that if you're not together, you're apart. And if you are apart, it can be a very painful experience, because conflict can only create a painful experience. And through that dialogue that came after the conflicts, and this vision of that one has to cooperate as much as possible, then came these big, decisions of opening the borders, for instance, so people can move from one country to the other, having the single currency, so on and so forth. So that helped a lot, actually, to create this common science and technology policy that we see nowadays. So the biggest research budget in Europe, it's actually the European Union budget as a single research budget. Of course, by the way, it's still, if you accumulate the research budget of every individual country, it's very small budget, by the way. It still represents only 5% of the accumulated, let's say, 27 countries budget. But still, as a single budget, is the biggest in Europe. It's bigger than any single country. So that means that we have a budget that works for the whole of the European Union, for the benefit of the whole European Union. And that came only through a lot of discussions and negotiations, but also with a very good will, actually, to create a kind of common approach.
I know that you've spent quite a lot of time working on something called Global TA. So I would like to ask you, what is Global TA, and why do we need it today?
Maybe to start with, TA, technology assessment, is it's a kind of a specific, let's say, undertaking that it does not happen everywhere with a name of technology assessment, but it actually happens everywhere in the terms of the content of what TA does. So assess the consequences of new technologies, let's say, of the new developments. And through the international projects that we did on science and technology, either specific developments like biotechnology, genetically modified foods, which are very contentious developments, actually, or generally the science and technology policy as such, we discovered, well, I would say the obvious, that we're all faced with the same problems. And when it comes to very contentious developments, as I said, like the GM foods, we're really faced through a very, very similar debates, very similar dilemmas. for policy making, and very similar uncertainties around these developments. So what we lacked was a similar approach to assess these developments. So everyone would go more or less ad hoc, as we say, just make it up as it goes, a kind of assessment. In Europe, we had more of a tradition, of course, of doing that, and we even had the tradition of trying to have a common approach, so like a common European TA. So we do have in Europe at least 2 or 3 major associations that bring together the European TA groups, let's say, that's under a single umbrella association. So we have the chance to discuss about these issues. We have the chance to exchange information, to have common projects, to have common methodologies, so on and so forth. But this lacked when it came to the global, let's say, situation, to the situation to the beyond the European Union frontiers. So by working with our colleagues in China, in India, in Australia, by the way, in Russia, and Brazil, and so on and so forth, we soon decided to try to get, let's say, again, everyone under a single umbrella association, but this time at the global level. So we developed what we call the Global TA Network, which is very new, by the way. We only started it, and unfortunately, only a couple of months before the Corona crisis. So that even stopped us from having what we hope to be our first global TA conference in person, of course, in 2020. But we're still actually moving on with that idea, and we even now are in contact with the UN, which is the UN system would be an obvious, by the way, a location for this type of global TA network.
When I was thinking about global TA, I was thinking about, is it possible to achieve fair global policies when national interests, needs, and context are so different? I'm thinking about, for example, smaller countries versus large economies, for example.
So whether it's possible or not, time will show. But whether we should work towards that direction, I would say yes, definitely. That's the answer. So if you work towards it, then we will have the possibility. If you don't work towards that, then we'll never have this possibility. So that's the way I see it. The UN system was built upon that premise. The premise that both big and small, strong and weak, everyone can work together towards the same goal and the same aim. And as time goes by with all these global problems, what we call in Europe the grand challenges of our life, we see that they all have the same problems, and the solutions are really more or less the same for every country. It is true, though, that when we started that global TA network, the most obvious members that they were active and they wanted to be really part of it, and they had also the possibility and the resources to work in this area were, of course, the stronger countries, the stronger economies, emerging economies of the world. So Corona has been a kind of gave us a very fast plateau of activity for 2020. So we didn't have the chance to develop as much as we'd like to, but we still actually, with the members are the main, the usual suspects, let's say. So it's the European Union, it's North America, it's China, it's India, it's Australia. We're working now with our South African colleagues. I've talked actually with some countries like, I don't know, Vietnam, like Namibia, countries that they are moving. They would like to move a lot towards science and technology development, but they yet do not have the resources to go as far as they would like. And they usually have the policy structures to allow for a really active global TA activity. That is usually the problem that we have with, let's say, weaker economy. The political structures, let's say, are not there. You cannot usually identify what is actually the policy, the structure that would allow someone to do a TA within that network. So there is a lot of inner work to be done there. And that's why we're also now working also with a UN system towards a capacity building let's say, activity in TA.
When you say capacity building, what do you mean by that?
So we need to first of all analyze the policy structures in account, the science and technology policy structures, to be exact, and to identify, let's say, strengths and weaknesses, and identify where TA could happen, what areas that would be of particular interest in the country for TA, and who should do and with what resources, let's say, TA, and then who can also bring in some kind of TA training, let's say, from basically the experiences of TA, not only that we have in Europe, but in other countries, and actually that they share more, let's say, the development trajectory of some of these countries. Like, for example, our colleagues in India or China, and they can share more actually with some countries about how they, let's say, integrate TA into the development trajectory, and how TA has helped their development trajectory. So that is what we're doing at the moment. We're starting a project actually with the UN, the UNCSTD, the Committee of Science and Technology for Development, that's in Geneva. They are under the how they call the plenary in the New York, and their role actually is to identify science and technology areas that can help developing countries. And their role is also to do what we would call technology assessments, but they haven't really activated that role so far. So now that we have created the global TA network, they also found, let's say, a group that can really work with them directly for this type of, let's say, aims that they had to start with. So now we will start a project quite soon, actually, in 21. We'll start a project with what we call TA capacity building in Africa. And we will take 3 countries as basically targets for this capacity building. That's going to be like a pilot work for the UN and for us. And we're at the moment, I believe it's South Africa. It's definitely on board, and almost certainly Namibia. And we're thinking the 3rd country might be Kenya, or I think there are still discussions there which countries can be part of it. So we will try to apply this idea, let's say, in African countries very soon.
How did you choose those countries? Were there certain criteria that you needed?
The UN committee chose them, and there I believe, okay, there was a lot of parameters that they're not actually maybe the same parameters that we have when it comes to the UN system. So one obvious parameter is that the country itself must want to be part of it. It might seem obvious, but it's not actually so obvious. Because there are different reasons why a country would like to be part of such a kind of pilot study, but definitely they need to also provide their own resources for that. Not a lot, but definitely resources, and most definitely a will to change, basically a will to restructure their science and technology policy. South Africa was a kind of perhaps an obvious candidate, but they had a strong will, from what I know, because South Africa is the local, let's say, science and technology superpower in Africa. There's a long tradition of science and technology, let's say, work development, and they are quite advanced compared to many other countries actually in Africa. But also there are countries that have a particular interest. Also, they have very significant development in certain areas, at least, like Kenya and Namibia. Also, they would like to be part of it. I would say it's mostly let's say a self acclamation, a self kind of motivation to be part of this grouping. That is the most significant parameter here.
Have you found any surprising similarities among stakeholders at the national and international level that you can leverage to build good policies?
What I will, our stakeholders are actually very wide-ranging grouping. So apart from the policymakers in the science and technology and the scientists themselves that have an interest, which are the main the stakeholders, we have, in our case, the way that we do TA, at least in Europe, the public, the general public as such, but specifically also NGOs that work in these areas, and of course industry, and whether it's a big industry or SMEs are also a part of our stakeholder grouping. So we invite them regularly in the debates that we organize, and we have a direct input in our technology assessment, let's say, process from these groupings. I see a lot of similarities in debates that happen, for instance, between Europe and China in biotechnology area. So whether it's genetically modified foods, or whether it's a gene technology, whether it's a genetic, let's say, editing, let's say, like we have recently, whether it's gene therapy, biological resources, for instance, bioenzymes, for example, development for energy. I see a lot of similarities in how people, the public, for instance, would see it as a interesting, but also fearful. For instance, they have a lot of concerns about these developments, particularly the closer it comes to them, like food, because we inject food, we take it into our system, and also medicines, of course. And I see there a lot of similarities of how these discussions are structured. I see also, of course, differences also in how ideas are incorporated, let's say, how the research are incorporated into the policy making, because we have very different policy making, of course, structures, as you can imagine. But also I see a difference in how, for instance, industry, how the private sector is viewing these developments, and whether and how they take the kind of concerns that we see from the public, for instance, in their own, let's say, development procedures. You know, there are quite a few differences, I would say, between Europe and non-European countries.
So then, when you see because I watched one of your talks, and you said it's important to focus on the similarities when we want to build global TA. So how do you then use the similarities? So, for example, you just mentioned fear that people have with things like GMO, for example. How do you then use that insight to develop S&T policy?
Yes, that is something that depends, of course, not only on our will to incorporate these concerns and how we incorporate them, but also on the possibilities that the system gives us to do that. I'd say that, in my opinion, every system, people sometimes, criticize the more centralized, let's say, systems. As you can imagine, like I don't know, China and Russia, who have more centralized, let's say, policy-making structures. Here in, I don't know, in many European countries, not in every European country, are quite decentralized. And we go, again, we have a quite big spectrum of how centralized is, maybe from our Nordic, let's say, countries, where they have a quite decentralized system, to a more centralized, more the let's say, the southern or the main, the center of Europe or the Eastern European countries. So we also have different systems here, and some are more willing than others to incorporate this kind of concerns into the policy making. Now, what means incorporating concerns? It doesn't mean that you have to legislate according to people's fears. What means is that you have to take into consideration these fears when you legislate, and you should always leave a possibility of, let's say, change within your legislative system. And in order to do that, the politicians have to be quite close, let's say, to these concerns and be part of the debate. This does not happen always, that the politicians are willing to be part of this debate. There are many reasons for that. Even our politicians, although they try to be as open, as close to the public as possible, they also have real limitations of how much they can be part of these public debates. And of course, needless to say, there is a lot of let's say, lobbying activity goes around them. There is a lot of powerful interests. Whichever way, powerful interest is not only industry, because people say that powerful industry is not only industry. NGOs have powerful interests as well for their own survival. So sometimes we even have problems with NGOs to be part of the debate. We have industry that wants to be part of a specific debate that has to do with sustainable development, and the NGO would say no, they don't want to be part of it because they have their own, let's say, agendas. So the politicians are everywhere there. They have to be aware of everything, and you have to take into consideration everything there. So I would say that I see, personally, I say willingness to not only listen to, but incorporate, let's say, these debates into policy decision making everywhere. But the way of doing that is very different.
Can you give an example?
I give you, let's talk about China and Europe, let's say, that I know a little bit better. So in Europe, we have a long tradition of what we call participatory technology assessment. Participatory technology assessment is basically an assessment procedure that incorporates as much as possible wide stakeholders. So anything from the public and the NGOs to any related, let's say, interest group, of course, industry, politicians, policymakers, and so on and so forth. So by bringing together such a desperate, let's say, groupings, you obviously have a lot of conflict. And that's not an easy kind of process to follow. Because sometimes these positionings that we have are so far from each other that it's well, almost impossible to bridge. Let's put it like that. It seems almost impossible to bridge. So it does take a bit of courage to start a process like that. Now, one would think that in China, they wouldn't be open to such a process. As a matter of fact, China had not only they had their own, let's say, participatory TA processes. For example, in GM foods that I know quite well, this area, like we had here, and actually the debates were very similar. I took part in a couple of these debates in China. So they were very open debates. The concerns were raised, the fears were raised in the same way. And even like in Europe, that we usually have the science and technology strategy papers developed by the ministries that they provide strong support for this type of participatory, let's say, an open dialogue processes. We have the same in China. The difference, I would say, is that is not sometimes here you will see a kind of direct relationship between the policy making result and that process. So this description of why the legislation is as it is will include that process of debate. So they will say that we did the debate, we did this kind of thing, we took, we involved this and that and that. They said that, the other said that, this kind of thing, and then we reach the conclusion that we should legislate in this way because of that or the other way. So the political debates about this process quite open. This does not happen in China. The political debate is still under closed doors, so to say. So the legislation is there. It's a direct legislation that comes through that closed door discussion. But it doesn't mean that it has not been informed as well from the, let's say, the participatory approach. So you see, there are differences there. They appear to be very strong differences, because what we perceive from the outside is that someone, and we don't know even who, or a very small group of people decide on something because they decided on that, and we don't know why they decided on that. But actually, the process behind that is not so different as our process. The style is different, let's say. Or at least that's the way I see it, because as I told you before, I'd like to look at the similarities and not at the differences.
Am I able to ask you whether you know why the process will be closed and not shared in the report in the Chinese version, or?
let's say that I respect how different systems do things differently. We have the same in Europe. We tend to look at, I don't know, Russia or China as these closed systems, but as a matter of fact, there are a lot of closed systems in Europe as well. Right. And a lot of, for example, people in Germany will complain that Germany has a closed system of decision making. I don't think so, but they're clear. There are many people who complain about that. Yeah, and you can see that, by the way, nowadays in the Corona situation, they really feel like that the lockdown is an attack on their human rights, basically. I don't think it's an attack on the human rights, but there is a percentage of people, and that's very small at all, that they really see this process as a kind of I don't know what, dictatorship into making. They have a very strong feeling about that. So it's really a matter of perspective, to be honest.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you something slightly different. How is the geopolitical tension affecting S&T policy development? For example, in Australia, sometimes we now hear the phrase technology Cold War. So I'm just wondering, geopolitical tensions.
A lot, unfortunately. A lot. And in the academic world, and also in the TA world, which is in between, let's say, policy and academia, we have a little bit our own world, let's say. So we communicate directly and openly, and we do not experience conflicts between our peers, let's say, around the world. So as you know, as well, normally also academic, they have their conferences, they do their own projects, they produce their publications, and it normally runs smoothly, apart from some kind of cultural, let's say, misunderstandings or whatever that might happen. But politics can have a direct effect, actually, in how things are happening. For instance, the Cold War, let's say, between China and the US, that was really accentuating with previous administration. We all know very well the Trump administration, the review of China, whatever. It had a really direct effect, from what I know, in our Chinese colleagues, because actually they stopped getting visa even to go to the United States. It became really difficult to get a visa. Then there was some kind of retaliation, if you like, from the Chinese government. So the visas became difficult also on the other side. Then we see more and more the politicization of some technologies. I mean, some technologies are by default, of course, politicized. I mean, you can imagine that any kind of military sensitive technologies, of course, politicized. And I understand that, and I respect that. So you cannot pretend to have any kind of open access, I don't know, open science, open innovation type of approach when it comes to military sensitive technologies. That's fine. That they should remain under the nation states and strictly, let's say, controlled by it. But now we have artificial intelligence, for instance. That artificial intelligence is it's an umbrella type of term that includes almost everything, but it has such a powerful implications for, let's say, development, trade development, and economic implications, that it has become quite politicized as well. So nowadays, even the word AI is a kind of nationally sensitive word. And one has to treat carefully in the global, international, let's say, collaborations around AI, simply because some politicians around the world, they have politicized AI, which I disagree, by the way, because you cannot just politicize something with AI, which is a very general term, but it has been done basically. So yes, politics play, unfortunately, have a direct implications in our work. So we always have to be aware and treat carefully.
Are there practical ways to navigate that challenge? Because obviously, technologies that can have the biggest impact can also solve the biggest problems.
Of course.
So is it a matter of waiting for the election cycle, or are there practical ways to navigate issues?
We can't do that. We cannot just wait and hope. We don't have a lot of time to wait. As you know, and I think as we all know, more or less, deep inside, we cannot wait much longer. Things are changing, sometimes a dramatic way. And okay, climate is the most obvious way, but you see now what happens with the pandemic. You cannot have politics stopping, let's say, a solution to the pandemic, whether that's a vaccine, whether it's a treatment or whatever. But unfortunately, even politics even played a role there. But what I meant to say that if there is a practical way to navigate through that, let's say, maze, is for me it's the most simple way. It's being open about it. So being open about what to do, why you do it, and you hope that people will understand and they will, let's say, respect that. And I think they do, to be honest. As I said, there is no reason why we should be doing, I don't know, drone technology, military drone technology together. Why should we do that? No, there is no reason. But there is definitely big reason to do work on, let's say, vaccine development or life science data exchange, for instance. We have big reasons to do that. Or the same with, of course, sustainable energy resources, like how we can develop, in a common resources. I would say, I don't know, there are gray areas that some people have more difficulty working on, but there are definitely areas that we should be working no matter what, no matter if people hate each other, if geopolitics is very strong, but still, it's a pandemic. We have to deal with that commonly. That's it.
Would it be too dramatic to say politics is also a grand challenge then?
Yes, tell that to the UN. Yeah. Yes, it's a huge challenge. Actually, it's a huge challenge for these grand social challenges that we are faced with. Perhaps the biggest is actually politics, or if you like, governance,
right.
Because it's implicit in everything we do. So if you want to have you have common problems, if you want to have common solutions, you need the common governance, right? And we don't have that. Supposedly, of course, we have the UN, you have the plenary, you have the member states, but we know very well that the UN system, it does not work well for a common. And I don't even know actually what is the best way to go about it. But as it is at the moment, it's not helpful. Right. To deal with our common problem. So governance is by far the biggest challenge that we're faced with.
That leads to a question that I wanted to ask you, which is which international organizations are leading the charge regarding global S&T policies? Which ones are most well equipped to do good S&T policies?
I'll say when it comes to the ones that have a tradition and resources and best equipped in terms of expert resource, in terms of funding, in terms of even willingness to work together, would be some like OECD, for instance. The OECD, of course, is not a global. It's, I don't know if you consider it exclusive or not, but definitely has a lot of members. But obviously, the more upper level of development is the OECD, but they definitely have the means, the experience, and the will actually to help a lot in the global S&T policy. Of course, in principle and traditionally, it should be a UN. Like, for example, this the social committee, which I still cannot remember the full name actually. Remit is actually to deal with grand social challenges, and they have a membership that covers the whole world. So in that sense, it's the UN system. It's the plenary in New York, is the Geneva, the Committee on Science and Technology for Development. These are the ones that have the appropriate membership and the appropriate structures, if you like, in principle, of course, because they're not functioning very well. They don't work as it should work, but they're there. They have the membership. They have their plenaries, they have the representation from every country, and they have even the official remit, the official, let's say, aim to do science and technology policy. So I think it's kind of obvious we have to stick with the UN system. We just have to help it be more effective, that's all.
What's missing, like, in your opinion, what's missing that will make the system work? What's the ideal situation for you?
It's political will, as simple as that. And this is something which cannot be solved. So geopolitics are also played, of course, I would say, in the UN system, as we know. It's an obvious thing, and that's okay in a way, because if you see the UN as a kind of, let's say, the big global parliament or something like that, of course, the parliament is a place where let's say in a democratic system, you have different parties which they basically, sometimes scream and shout at each other, and they undermine each other in order to promote their own agenda. So why should the UN be different? But still, and if we see it as a means not only to promote our own, let's say, national agenda, but also to promote the common the resolutions to the common problems as it should be, then I believe there should be a kind of more neutral, let's say, view of science and technology within the UN system. So there, the politics should not play a big role. So it should be left to, let's say, technocrats to run it, as simple as that. I mean, the WHO, for instance, it was meant to be like that, and it did work like that. But still, politics even came into this, as you know, recently. But I still think that the WHO is a kind of a place where it's a technocratic place that has done good work and could do much better work once they get the resources to do that, because they still lack a lot of resources.
What kind of impact does RITA have on economic growth? Neutral, positive, negative?
That's another $1 million question, because it's one thing where what I say, it's another thing what I can prove. The way that TA works is work as a policy advisory. So policy advisory is basically a supporting role within the policy-making system. It is a significant role that it plays, but it's a significant role as far as the people who are involved see it as a significant, let's say. And this for us is basically our impact assessment. It's basically our clients, which is basically the policy-making community, basically whether they see our work as significant in their decision making. Let's say now it is difficult to go at the macroeconomic level and try to figure out whether the macroeconomics, the economy as such, is better off with a TA than without a TA, let's say, system. I would say, in a way, it's also common sense that you need an assessment to in order to make a decision, right? I mean, how can you have a decision without having a proper assessment? So in that way, it's an obvious plus to have an assessment. The question is that what kind of assessment and what kind of TA is the more effective TA? There are big questions there that we haven't resolved yet. Because we have a different methodologies, TA, some are more open to dialogue, some are less open to dialogue. Some are more expert-oriented, some are more, let's say, general public or NGO-oriented, because it depends really on the technology at hand. But it's my strong belief that, and I think one can even see it in a very general sense, that countries that have, let's say, better economies, that they are, let's say, more developed, they also have a much more vibrant STI sector. So that's there. I think it's an obvious let's say, relation. No one doubts this kind of relation between STI and development, you know. And there we have a good, actually, impact assessment procedures to really look at the innovation potential of the country and the economic potential of the country. They're more or less a very high correlation, let's put it like that. So if you see TA as an integral part of the STI national development, then I would say that ATA is an integral part of the microeconomic potential of the country as well.
Do you think there's an optimum balance between introducing incentives to encourage responsible innovation, for example, versus punishments to discourage this irresponsible innovation?
Yeah, that's also a big, by the way, a big debate within the responsible innovation, let's say, discussion groups. Of course, responsible innovation goes without saying that this should be promoted, and irresponsible innovation should be punished. But then we have to also define what we mean by that. And I would say the one obvious way that the irresponsibility is defined is by being unethical. Let's say, so if you equate irresponsible with unethical, then it's much easier to figure out actually what should be punished, even not only not promoted but punished, like the genome editing, for instance, that happened in Shenzhen, for instance, and in the beginning, even the people who were involved with this, like this gentleman, he was completely shocked that people would find it wrong. And the question is why he was shocked. Because we didn't have really a proper decision making to what constitutes unethical in this kind of new developments. But very soon, the decision was made, even in that. We know what is unethical in many other developments. We know what's unethical in clinical trials. People are punished if they don't follow the ethical route, the responsible, let's call it, route in this type of innovations. So now we know also that you can be punished if you do genome editing in human beings somehow. So it's easier, you know, because he did some unethical. That's what's the official the discussion and decision there, what he did unethical. Now, when it comes to responsible innovation, I would say yes, of course, we should promote any kind of responsible innovation. We just have to figure out how we see responsible innovation. For instance, a lot of the work that has been done around responsible innovation is particularly focusing on participatory aspects of innovation. So the participation, let's say, of I don't know, public or other interest group in the innovation process. And I would say, okay, that sounds a good idea in principle, but is it really implementable? Because you know there are limits to how much you can open up your innovation process to outsiders.
IP.
There are good, yeah, exactly. There are very good reasons why you have to keep the innovation process sometimes hidden or secret. And before a certain level, which is almost the implementation level. So you cannot be accused for being, let's say, irresponsible or not responsible because you didn't up your innovation, you didn't open up your innovation process, let's say, to outsiders. Sometimes there's good reason why you don't do that.
I would like to ask you about China, because you did say that you spent quite a lot of time in China. Have you found anything that really surprised you and perhaps would also surprise other listeners?
Yeah, yes, I could say a lot of things about China, and I can almost only say positive things, to be honest. That is my personal experience in China. So, for example, one surprising thing that I found, and I still have a hard time to persuade my colleagues who have not worked in China about, is the openness that I found. Because we all have this idea that China is a very closed place. And of course, it's true that it's much closer decision-making procedure, as I said before, than what we're used to in the West. That goes without saying. But the fact that the decision-making procedure is closed doesn't make the society closed, doesn't make the process of debate closed? Does it make our collaborations, for example, closed, if you like? And I would say no, actually. My experience of China has been a quite open debate. I have seen quite open collaborations who have collaborated in almost everything that there is to collaborate in our area, at least. I still repeat, if you want to work in I don't know what, I don't know, security systems or whatever, yeah, you don't try. If you want to collaborate with China security systems, then yeah, you will not be able to do that. But then it's the same in many countries, including the US, by the way. So I don't consider that as a bad thing personally. So my personal experience collaborating with China is open. Basically collaboration, and it's I won't say without challenges. There are challenges. There are even cultural challenges that one is faced with. For instance, the way that the debates are taking place. We are used to hear that there are I don't know, there is a big group of people, and they are not only open but very blatant somehow to the way that they approach the debates. They can be very accusatory, they can be offending even, and usually does not, but not always, but it even is non-hierarchical as well. So you can have a young person coming up and say that I completely disagree with this thing, and this is it's crap, it's but whatever. They can be quite strong and offensive in that thing. This you don't see in China. It's a much more polite way of addressing the debate. It's hierarchical. A junior person will never overtake the senior person in the debate. They will always have the lower level of interaction that the senior person will always give. So I consider that not the closed political system. I consider it as a kind of a cultural difference there. So in that sense, it can be kind of challenging, actually, to have a common debate.
So then would the, say, junior person still voice their opinions in that kind of situation, or?
I think they will always respect the senior person, and they will not create a conflict with a senior person. Definitely not an open conflict. Here you can see this can happen. Actually, you can say I disagree with you, especially with our Nordic friends. Sometimes we're even shocked about how disagreements, some of themselves, are so blatant, for instance, but they're used to it. The Dutch people are used to having it doesn't mean a lot. They can shout at each other and they can still reach a common decision. So even we as Germans, let's say, are shocked sometimes with how blatant and open they can be, because here we also have our kind of implicit hierarchies. But in China, for instance, they're quite strong, these hierarchies. And I dare say, like, let's say in Russia is also like that. Less so than in China, but more. And also the use of the words, there could be much more. Okay, that could be also a kind of translation issue there, but not as direct. It can be going around basically the subject a lot.
Yeah.
So you need to pick actually the main points sometimes. While here we're used to sometimes be, well, here, when I say here, I mean maybe Germany. Sometimes we complain about our UK colleagues that they are kind of talking a lot around it, but they don't give us really a kind of straightforward answer.
Would you mind giving us an example of a project you've worked on with China, just to demonstrate, so we help you to visualize what you mean by being open? So you spoke about open dialogue. Were there other aspects that you thought, oh, wow, this is actually a bit different to what I thought this experience would be like?
one of my first experiences, and one of the most positive experiences, the one that was almost shockingly positive for me, was the GM food debate, actually. That's also my background. I took part in that debate, actually analyzed for my PhD in the 90s already. So when we first had the first GM foods arriving in Europe, and there was all this huge, the conflicts arising out of that. That's ended up in basically the banning of GM foods and even the technology, more or less, in Europe. So that at the time was really one of the strongest and most conflictuous debates we had with the United States, for instance, with our colleagues there, because they're all like completely positive. They couldn't understand what on earth is wrong with the Europeans. They do not accept GM food. What's wrong with GM foods? And the Europeans were completely like, this is the hell on earth, basically. The GM food is going to destroy everything that we live for and what we believe in, and so on and so forth. So there was very strong debate. So later on, these debates started in China, and I was shocked of how open these debates were. You would also have people like prominent people coming up in the debates and they say, what is, this kind of GM foods, they want to destroy us, they will, kill us, they will make this kind of thing, and what is the government thinking about that? So they should stop it immediately, and there's no way we can accept it. So you saw this kind of very similar approach to, I don't know what, everyone says the government, but this thing, there is no way I can accept this thing. A very emotional kind of reaction that I have only experienced in Europe, and I assumed it was because it was the European openness that created it. And then I saw it happening in China, and in China actually we had more or less the similar approach. In the beginning, there was a kind of uncertainty about that, but there was a kind of positive, from a technocratic point of view, a kind of positive approach to the GM, let's say, food. And then there were public reactions that became very obvious, actually, reactions. They reached the media quite fast. There were people complaining everywhere. And if you like, they almost pressurized and the government into reconsidering, actually, their technocratic approach. And the result was more or less the same like in Europe. So you have a much more careful, actually, approach to the GM food and GM in agriculture in general. So I found that quite positive, and I think also from my Chinese colleagues, it was one of the things that created this kind of the new China, the new openness within the Chinese society, that came along with the openness in trade, for instance, in the individual, let's say, individual movements, individual developments within that trade, and how people were free to start their businesses and to do things that they wanted to do. So it was part of the whole kind of process.
Do you see that happening? So that was in the 90s something. Do you see that similarity with other projects over time?
Yes and no. I would say that as far as I'm concerned, we have reached the point when in China there are public debates for every scientific and technological development of a certain, let's say, sensitivity. So we had similar debates in China in the nanotechnologies, for instance, which was an interesting debate because again, nanotechnology, of course, it's like AI. It's a very general umbrella. So in Europe, we started early this nanotech debates because of the problems that we had with the biotech debates in the past. So governments were kind of quite willing to open up a debate about nanotechnology applications quite early to avoid this kind of conflicts, which are very costly, by the way, economically costly, this kind of debates. If you develop products that they cost the billions, and then the market doesn't take it, basically, and then you have to even to ban them, that can be really costly. So with the nanotech debate, we started it early as well. And kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't call I wouldn't say the word imported, but it was the kind of also taken up in China. So in China, we had an interesting situation whereby in the beginning, before there was a public debate about nanotechnologies, there were commercial products that they were advertised as having a nanotechnology or nanoparticles, like I don't know, these creams, like face creams or this kind, it was a nanotechnology made type of thing. And then the debate started. And because you had also, the already some ready-made arguments that you could take from Europe about the positive and negative aspects, they were all taken up similarly in China. And then the perception, people's perception of nanotechnology started changing from a positive by default because it sounded good to a debate about the pros and cons, and then started becoming more negative. And actually, from what they told me, they stopped advertising. It's actually nowadays is considered negative to advertise a product that contains nanotech material, let's say. So it was an interesting development there, and that was also the result of a public debate. So policy had nothing to do with that. The risk assessment, the official risk assessment and the procedures that create the science and technology policy decision making was completely different than the public debate. But the results was as we see it. So now nanotech is also slowly, like in Europe, slowly and very carefully taken up. It's not, yes, great nanotech, and let's say, let's put it everywhere we can type of thing.
Are the debates held by the support of the government, or do they run separately?
Both, I would say. One thing is that the government itself has incorporated actual official, and the official, I have to remember now which number of the 5-year plan. Since 2014, let's say about, yeah. So 2014, 15, the RRI, the Responsible Research and Innovation, and the public participation, let's say in decision making and science and technology policy issues, is being written as a kind of aim within the 5-year plan for science and technology. So it shows definitely a will, at least in writing. Let's put it like that. So in writing, there is a will to have a political a policy, let's call it like that, a policy initiated debates, open debates about science. So that's one thing. The other thing is the media debates that happen. And the media debates in China, they happen everywhere, from the local social media to the official media. And science and technology is an issue that's, it's almost impossible not to create a public debate, because nowadays it has a direct effect, so it's like whatever people say, whether it's good or bad, I still have to decide whether I will drink this water, which is, I don't know, it has, it's chlorinated or whatever, so I have to decide whether I will drink chlorinated water or not. So there must be an S&T debate about the pros and cons of chlorinated water, so I can make my decision. And this can only be in the public by the use of media, let's say. So you cannot avoid that nowadays. So if you have people that make their own decision whether they're going to drink the water or not, then you must have also debate about chlorinated water, as simple as that. And in that sense, it's a good thing for the policy. So the politicians would like to create that debate, because it's also good for them, if you know what I mean. They need to make a decision about whether to chlorinate or not to chlorinate. Because if they make the wrong decision, people will simply not drink it. You cannot make people drink something they don't want to drink anymore. And that would be a problem. That would be an economic problem, let's say. That could be a social problem for the politician to resolve. So I think there is a will. How far it goes, I don't know. It's in the eyes of the beholder, how far this thing goes. Many people outside of China will tell you it doesn't go far enough. But then their standards are like the Dutch standards. And I don't think we should judge China with the Dutch standards, if you know what I
mean. Let's talk about your projects. I understand you're working on quite a few RI projects at the moment. Would you like to share with us what you're working on?
First of all, RRI was it's easier to call it almost in the past, by the way, in the past tense about working in RRI, because specifically RRI, not responsible innovation, responsible research innovation, this particular that term was created within the European Union, within the European Commission system, and it was financed almost exclusively in Europe by this budget. So the RRI projects that you hear about are almost exclusively, like 90-something%, funded by the European Union budget. I say 90-something because you had also a small national funding in Norway that was specifically on RRI, and also in the Netherlands. But apart from these two countries, I know of no other country that had an RRI. It doesn't mean that they don't do work in the area, but just because you said RRI, just to give you the most recent information, let's say. And this thing now is not there anymore. In the new framework program that will start in the new budget, let's say the European Union budget that starts now in 2021, RRI is not anymore a main funding issue. So there will be no more projects that they are called RRI in industry, RRI, whatever, because there will be no call for this project. If at all, RRI will, or at least some aspects of RRI will be incorporated into bigger projects that, I don't know, let's say medical development projects, energy projects, whatever. They will have an aspect that will be called a responsible, let's say, innovation or social aspect, or as a matter of fact, what now they call open science. So open science would be a term that will be used, and you might see open science projects. So TA is basically what the Commission is defined as RRI. So it's a very, very similar work. We try to view RRI through this lens, the TA lens. One big work that we did was the application of RRI, the incorporation of RRI within the organizational context, the research organizational context. So where we looked at a wide range actually of national research funders and research organizations around the world, including Australia, by the way. And we look at how they view RRI, basically the content of RRI, not just the term, because they never heard of the term. And actually, so how they view responsibility in their research and innovation process, how they incorporate this view within the organizational structure, and how they would like to see an assessment of, let's say, their own incorporation of responsibility within their organization. We also look at the RRI, or let's say responsibility within the innovation process, within the industry, and particularly also we concentrated on the industry that is dealing with the aging society. So let's say the products which are specifically geared towards the welfare of the aging population, because it's a very particular population and also a big challenge, as you know, in many countries in the world, definitely in Europe. We did a lot of work in the conceptual work about TA versus RRI versus sustainability research, because this is what is very important nowadays, not only, of course, globally, but also in Germany. In Germany, the sustainability research is almost equivalent in terms of the values it upholds to the responsible innovation, to RRI, responsible research and innovation. So for us, it's quite important to also conceptualize well within the country these three, let's say, RRI, TA, and SR, sustainability research within the German context. So we have done a lot of work in this area as well. So these are all related to the RRI concept.
So I think I'll ask you my last question. What's next for you in terms of a project you would love to work on? And what do you think is the next thing for Global TA?
Well, the next thing for me, the global TA is almost identical nowadays. So I'm trying to develop a global TA as much as possible, actually, because, well, I explained before, because we need it, and because it's also the time to do it. The pandemic, from one hand, stopped us from developing the network as we wanted to develop. On the other hand, it gave us even more of an impetus and more of a, let's say, argument of how of what and how much more we need to put energy into developing this network. And I think it's clear nowadays that we have to develop now, also because the pandemic created this kind of need to concentrate a little bit on life science data. To start with, data governance. That would be one issue, because if you want to create a kind of a common science and technology approach, if you want to create a common resolution, if you want to create, you know, let's say a common science and technology developments and products, then you need to have common data on and to have to work on common data. And common data is not as simple as it sounds. I don't know if it sounds simple, but anyway, it's extremely complicated. Because common data means that you have to bring in the data sets from different countries into a single, let's say, roof. And countries are not very happy to share data. And of course, you might say that there's data and data. So we want to concentrate on that data which is less contentious data, which is not so easy to find, less contentious data. But anyway, but for us, is life science data, for example, would be the number one priority, and also the one that we can easier argue for. So we have, China actually has a huge amount of life science data. They have the biggest gene bank in the world. And they collect. They want to collect even more data. They want to reach even the 100 million, you know, human genetic maps within, I don't know what is the plan now, the next 5 years or whatever. And they can do it actually. We also have big data sets, life science data sets in the US, but not as big, not even close to that actually, in the UK. And even here in Germany or in other countries. So these are data sets. Let's say if you want to create, to develop a new vaccine, the more data you have, the easier it is, the more accurate and the better actually products you will have, the less, let's say, risky products, since everyone is worried about the risks of vaccination. So we need that. We need that to create new vaccines, and fast actually. We need that to create new treatments, new medicines, and so on and so forth. The question is that how we can do that, and by definitely by upholding the main values and the main legislation that we even have nowadays. Let's say in Europe, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that it means that it has to be either anonymized or definitely to protect the individual's rights to privacy, and give the individual the right to actually exclude themselves from it, and so on and so forth. So in China now we have very similar, by the way, legislation since last year, as a matter of fact. So in principle, we don't even have a really conflict there in terms of legislation. In the United States, we don't have such kind of legislation. So we have to be faced with these issues, and also also with even the data governance architecture that would allow us for this kind of development. So we're looking at blockchain, for instance, as a possible architecture for this type of developments. But anyway, to bring it back to the original question, this is what we'd like to work on. So basically develop the global TA network, develop our common understanding of assessment, develop standard methodologies for doing that, standard assessment procedures, develop our capacity building activities in countries that they would like to have that, and pilot it, this global TA approach, to life science data, if possible, to the life science area, basically.
Well, sounds fascinating. And I hope everything goes well for you. Sounds like a really huge project.
Yeah, it is actually.
um, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been really interesting to hear, in particular, how different countries differ and cultures differ, because I think that has a huge impact on everything that we do, not just in policy, but technology design and just normal communications between countries and individuals. So thank you very much. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.